Hey everybody, I'm Longfam. Welcome. This is the video of my process to make this final image. But before getting into this, I would like to start talking a little bit about thumbnails and design sketches, because I think it's really important to start on a good base and start simple. This is drawing in on paper. It's the simplest way, and it's definitely really fun to try to come up with different shapes and different forms. And if you want to be original, I think it's a really good practice to try different mediums. You can do the same in Photoshop, or use watercolor, for example, with a brush, and really trying using different mediums and playing with it usually helps coming up with something different. Because if you always draw on your own, on the same with the same pen and on the same piece of paper, you'll tend to make the same shapes over and over. And a good way to get out of that is to try something different. So back to Photoshop, you can draw thumbnails or silhouettes, and drawing silhouette is a cool way to see the overall balance of your object and the proportions. And it's a really important thing to be able to see that from the beginning, so then you don't have that much changes to do after. So doing thumbnails is a great thing. These ones are made with custom shapes that I made myself. I have a little library of shapes that I drew in Photoshop and that I use over and over and distort them, and I'll show you that later in the demo. The actual process that I'm going to use for the final ship is this one with the smudge tool. And the smudge tool, as long as you use a hard, either square or form with hard edges, you'll be able to use it as how can you call that, like you push and pull pixels around, and it will help you to make different shapes. And that's how I make these. It's a different thing. It's very different than normal drawing, and I really enjoy it. So if you like that, try it out. On top of these, I would do lighting after the fact. Find first some sort of design proportion that I like, and then do some lighting on it to make it look a bit more finished. Alright, this is a quick demo of the custom shapes that I used to make the silhouettes that I showed earlier. It's a nice process because it's really fast when you already have a little library established, and you can make these really easily. And if you Google my name and custom shapes, you'll find some resources on that. I will even add some of these to your resources folder that you can download directly on Imagine FX website. So yeah, I just select some of these and drop them on the canvas, distorting them and stretching them and placing them where I want, and it helps me to come up with interesting silhouettes. So it's a bit of an exploration, really. I don't have any idea in mind. I just place the shapes and try to find some interesting balance, proportions, and overall shape. It's pretty fun to play with, especially because it's so fast. Just add a little bit of perspective in there. Something really simple, just to give you an idea. Alright, I'll keep making more of these. As you can see, the process is really fast. The total time for this little demo is around 15 minutes. This is sped up 4 times. But the idea is to get as much ideas as I can on the canvas from the start, so I don't lose too much time there. I'm trying to think of the overall structure of my ships. Usually it has a fuselage and a cockpit on top or on the bottom. But yeah, fuselage, cockpit, some sort of engine area, exhaust on the back, maybe a weapon, maybe some sensor array, some antennas. I'll keep it really simple, really. And as you can see, some of them are inspired by modern airplanes or boats. And that's something that I like to do, try to get inspiration from stuff that already exists. And that's the end of the demo for that. And now this is the actual these are the actual thumbnails that I did for the final image. These two I didn't use, but you can see the process for the smudge tool sort of technique that I like using. I just have a starting plate that I made. For these I made in 3D. It's a really basic model. I slapped some texture on top of it, and I use it as a base to start. So it doesn't really matter what you use. Earlier I showed some pictures I made just with basic Photoshop brush strokes, but I like to use some pictures with already some detail in it, so in color, so it helps me. It's a bit faster, but it doesn't really matter. I'm just duplicating things around. Here, making some sort of cockpit, adding some wing stuff in the back. Doesn't make any sense really, but I'm mostly concentrating on the silhouette and the proportions. And that's really about it. Alright, so I didn't use these, but the next one is the one I actually used for the final image. And it's the same thing. I'm just looking for interesting proportions and shape and the overall silhouette. Yeah, sometimes I like to duplicate the layer, distort it, warp it around, and see if I can find something more interesting. And here I have my idea. this back with the cockpit on top, and the front has an elongated nose. But that's the overall theme that I like, and I'll try to keep this going with, at the same time, refining the proportion of the object, because right now it's very 50-50. I'm just trying to make it a little bit more interesting, like this, for example, distorting some parts and changing the overall proportions without changing that design too much, because the idea is still the same. And just refining the silhouette. And I like the idea of having the cockpit on the top and the whole body underneath. It gives a little bit of an imbalanced feeling, and I kind of like that. So I'm pushing that, duplicating and distorting again. Really, that's about it. I'm just trying to focus on the overall impression of this thing. This is supposed to be a fighter spaceship, but I didn't want to make it too small, so I imagined something a little bit more like a big cruiser, and maybe a carrier that has like a hangar and shipment fighters inside of it that you could launch to help in the fight. So I'm liking this idea, but I'm still trying to refine the proportions and the silhouette. And checking with the earlier version to see if what I liked before is still there, because sometimes you can lose it during the painting process. So always check back and make sure that I still have the same sort of dynamic idea that I had in the sketch. It's still a sketch though. I'm refining a little bit, trying to make sense of these interlocking shapes, I'm trying to understand it for myself, because right now this thing is really a big mess. And that's the weird thing about this kind of process, is that you start with something that's really complicated and then you try to simplify it and make sense of it, instead of starting from a really simple drawing and adding details on top of it. It's a different way to work, and both kind of have different sort of appeal. I'm just going around and refining. Sometimes going in for smaller details, which I shouldn't do at this point, but it's always hard to not go in and zoom in and try to make these little details make sense. Always zoom out and look at the overall proportions and shape. So I do like the idea. I know it's the direction that I want to go into, but I'm still not sure of the silhouette. I want something a little bit more exciting. It's a bit boring right now, but the idea is there, so I know that I just have to try things out. Here I'm dropping some shapes just to try to make that silhouette, to push the silhouette a little bit, really. So because I know that I like this one, the adjustments are always a little bit smaller than in the beginning. That's how it goes. You start really broad with big strokes, and then as you refine, you make your brush a little bit smaller and smaller. I'm still trying things out, still trying to change the design, but Now I'm looking at the silhouette in black and white, because with all the details sometimes it's hard to see. And adding some volume to this nose, adding this double curve to make it a little bit more interesting, because right now it's very flat because of the 2D nature of this smudge tool. Even though you can add some volume by changing the stroke direction, it's still a really flat sketch, so distorting it a little bit to add that 3D feeling. Really, at this point, I'm just trying to make sense of the shapes of this thing. How are these planes relating to each other? How is it all interconnecting into the body? Because then when I have to paint it, when I have to paint the lighting on top of that, I need to know what directions are the plane turning into, so I can use this knowledge to then add lighting on top. And this stage really takes time for me, because I like to have I think it's best if you're sure that your design is good, to then do rendering on top. So that's what I'm trying to get, like have a really good idea of the volumes of the shapes. Here I'm pushing the silhouette a little bit, adding a little wing. I thought it was boring in the back. I'm still not sure about these wings. But I like the color, so I'm repeating the same color into the ship, so it makes it looks like it's one object instead of just a collection of stuff put together. Here I changed the wing designs. I still don't like it, but yeah, just trying. But it doesn't really matter if you don't like it. Just spend the time, maybe do something else and come back to it. So here I'm using a different type of smudge to add some details. And now I'm adding a gun. And because it's a fighter, I needed to have weapons, but I didn't really want to drop the weapon first and make it a big part of the silhouette first, because it's very easy to forget the rest of the design when you have an interesting, super huge gun. That's always something that I'm trying to do. Keep the weapons for the end, because I know that the idea is there already. So now I can focus on smaller stuff. And here I duplicate the ship, and on the clipping mask, drop it on that silhouette of the gun. So I already use the same sort of details and colors from the ship onto the gun, so it makes it fit together. So playing with proportions of it, extending and duplicating and all that. Here I'm using the custom shapes again to play with the silhouette, to make it a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more interesting. Add a muzzle. Here I'm playing with the idea of maybe having two of them, but I really didn't like that, so. And checking with the guide, the middle of the page, because this is going to be a spread in the magazine, so I had to make sure that there's no major point of interest in there, in the middle. And now it's time to play with the background a little bit, and the way I do it is just duplicate details from my ship, so I get the same colors, same sort of value, and then I blur it. Use a motion blur to make it look like it's going really fast, and just to give me something back there. Just adjusting the colors, the values, and using gradients to add some atmosphere. And then I'll just draw shapes in the back to give an impression of having an environment back there. But I didn't have time to make a whole environment, so I'll make it blurry and just recede back there, but just be there but still subtle. Using more gradients to indicate some sort of ground plane down below. Now I'm adding some shadow just to separate it from the background a little bit, because it's the same value structure, it's very similar, and the ship's getting a little bit lost in the background, so I'm adding stuff behind it to kind of separate it. Still really quick at this stage. And now I'm adding a perspective grid to kind of help me explain the volumes a little bit easier. Because at this stage I know the design is alright, so now I can start explaining the volumes in perspective, so this thing looks like it's an environment instead of being just a 2D flat shape. So I'm distorting it, making it look like it comes a little bit towards us. And now it's time to refine everything. And really this step is the longest. I know I have overall design right. Now it's just making sense of everything, because it's still really rough. If you look at it right now, when I zoom in, it doesn't make any sense, and I need to fix that. So I'm deciding, what is that element? How does it fit in the perspective that I choose? And how these planes interlock, how the shapes interlock and relate to the main body of the ship. So really, that's what it is. Just fixing everything now. Really slowly simplifying everything. I guess it can be a bit boring to watch, but that's the whole process, so that's why it takes me to finish all that. I'm adding some cut lines. It kind of helps explain the volume a bit easier. Just by adding cut line there, you can see how the shape turns in volume. Kind of reinforces the idea of volume in there. And I'm mostly using a paintbrush now. From time to time I do switch to the smudge again, like right now. It just depends on what I want to do. Yeah, sometimes using the lasso is really convenient when you want to retain some edges. So it makes everything cleaner. And I'm still distorting these planes, trying to describe the curve a little bit better. Okay, messing with that wing again. It was annoying me the whole time. I'm trying to make it interesting and follow also the same design as the ship itself. In the end, I think it's a bit simpler now. Now I'm cleaning up the gun and describing the roundness of that cylinder, the cannon. Just following the grid. Yeah, I'm going back to an earlier sketch and stealing the top wing from it because I liked it. And in the process I had lost it, so just go back, copy paste, and then distort it to follow the perspective again. And also using the grid, I'll draw what I think is the second one on the other side, on the far side. It's really easy when you have the grid on. And now I'm doing the lighting. So for this I create a new layer, and because I choose the sunlight coming from the top, I'll just draw, using this layer, I'll draw light on all the planes facing up, so the ones that are closer to the sun basically. And that's why I spent so much time trying to refine all these forms. So now I understand the overall shape of it, and I can just drop that light on all the top planes. Now, because of some of these shapes are rounded and they're turning away from the sun, I'm adding gradients to show that. Have the value change across the shape. And just refining that layer before I use the overlay blending mode. And it will just push these values up towards this yellow that I choose for the color of the light. And I'm doing the exact same thing with the shadows. So a new layer on top on the clipping mask, and this one I use the multiply blending mode in a different hue. This is a bit warmer. I think it will change anyway in the end. So any plane that's facing down, away from the light, gets darker. It's really that simple. All right. Now, because the sun is coming from the top and it's illuminating the ground underneath the ship, the ground is becoming a second light source, so it's reflecting light up and onto the bottom of the ship. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm trying to imagine this as a really large light source coming from the bottom and illuminating the bottom of the ship. So this light's going to be less intense than the main one, but still going to be there. So it's really important to kind of have that impression of realism. It's the same process. Each plane that's facing that light receives some light. Here I'm using in the blending options of the layer. There's the blend if function, and it allows you to make that layer invisible or visible depending on what's underneath. So I don't want this light to appear in the cracks, and so that's why I use the blend if function. Allows me to just erase that layer in some areas without having to actually erase it. Now pushing the core shadow a little bit, just on the multiply layer again, and just looking at all these places where the surface is perpendicular to the sunlight direction, and adding that soft core shadow there. Now I'm gonna work on smaller details like cut lines. The cut lines are really helpful to show volume again, in addition to the lighting. And also helps with the scale of the object. It shows the size of the panels. I'm going everywhere around the ship, adding these cut lines to describe the shapes even more. And refining everything at the same time. So some of the smaller areas still are not completely defined yet. So that's when I go back and try to fix everything. Yeah, adding some detailing there. I'm going to do some more refining, and directly with the brush, just fixing smaller areas and adding a bit more interest in those flat panels. Some of the big panels are really just plain and there's nothing interesting going on there, so I'm adding some smaller little cuts or shapes in there. Here I'm refining the actual value of this plane because it's turning a little bit from looking up to a little bit more toward us, so it should receive less light than these top planes. I used the darken layer for that. Same thing here, adding more light there. And secondary details again, making this hull a little bit more complex and interesting, because it still is really simple now. For a ship that's that size, I wanna add a lot of smaller details to make it feel like it's big, and instead of just a toy. I'm pushing the reflected light again, so I lost it a little bit. And now I'm really focusing on detail. So thinking about small things like intakes or things sticking out of this big ship will help with the scale impression of it. And just always distorting to follow the perspective. And fixing the perspective again on these areas. This thing is rounded, so I need to show that. just more detail over and over. Here I'm fixing the front. I really didn't like that nose that I had since the beginning, and I really didn't know what to do with it, so I ended up using the custom shapes to find some interesting design there. And then on the new layer with the clipping mask again, I'm adding secondary details with more shapes. It gives me a good impression of what this looks like, so then I can come back with a paintbrush and fix it. And the cool thing with the custom shapes is that usually, because they're really sharp, they retain a lot of detail, and it really helps with scale. It's something that would be pretty hard to paint directly. And another detail that I just thought adding some tanks full of whatever, really, I don't know. Just duplicating it and dropping it on there. So all these little details add up, and together can give the impression of, having a functional object rather than, again, a toy. So cast shadow. More cut lines. Cut lines are cool. Now doing some adjustment to the background, changing color of it a little bit, and using gradient maps to kind of tie everything together. Gradients maps are interesting tool because it will apply a color that you specify depending on the value that's underneath. So it's a really nice tool to color things up and to change your scheme, and it's a fun thing to experiment with. Again, I just like sometimes to just play with it for a few minutes and try to find something a little bit better. A little bit of bloom from the white lit parts, and a bit more work on the background. Very simple still, there's not much to it. I'm just trying to give an impression of volume in there, of space. So I'm adding some more of the ground plane. Later I'll add some clouds. And playing with the value of it, because I still think it's a bit too close to the ship in value and color. So the ship is kind of lost in there. But slowly I'll fix that. So I jumped a little bit here, but all I did was just paint some clouds and then use the smudge tool to kind of blend them, make them soft, and then blur it. Yeah, like I'm doing right now, just using the smudge to get rid of these hard edges. And now adding the light trail coming out of the engines in the back. We'll add some impression of movement. It's very simple, just duplicated the colors of the ship really and just motion blur. And that's it really. I'm using adding trails on the flaps of the wings, just like you can see sometimes in, on fighter jets. Just a little detail, just for fun. And I'm gonna start working on texture, because this ship is really the hull itself doesn't have any texture on it, and it looks really small because it doesn't have that much detail. And so what I do is I duplicate the ship layer and then I change its color and I make it lighter, and then I mask it completely and paint into the mask to reveal this lighter layer that I have on top of my ship. And now, because I use the ship layer itself duplicated because I want to retain some of the details, for example the darker cut lines and all that. And I'll paint on the mask, reveal that, and it will show that different color. And changing this color also helps with the overall realism of it. It's a very blue fantasy spaceship, but I still wanted to have that a little bit of realism into it. So I'm still adding more details. Just some small warning signs and little bits of color here and there, just to complement that blue. Don't want to go too far. Here you go, adding little bits of paint. It could be signify that there's a way you can open this panel for the for the maintenance crew, something like that. Here I'm selecting this thing and duplicating, like copy, merge, and paste to have that that light trail on one layer, and then I use a filter in the filter gallery that's called the ocean ripples. It's outside of this screen right now because I was using it on the second screen, but I like to do that. It kind of reminds you of what happens in atmosphere when there's a really hot engine, kind of warps the air around it. It's a nice effect. And now I'm doing the texture. So just like before, I duplicated a layer and changed its color, make it lighter with the levels. And now I'm painting in the mask, so I reveal that layer and I try to paint around areas where the paint could have been chipped from, dust in space or projectiles or just normal wear from use in outer space. So every area that's sticking out a little bit would receive stuff over the years, and it would destroy the paint there. So that's what I'm doing right now. Just painting the cracks and the holes in the paint. Kind of reveals the underneath metal, gray metal that could be there. It's a good way to make this thing not look like brand new or like a little toy. So I'm just going everywhere around this thing and looking at the planes and asking myself, would this thing be in contact with the the outside stuff that's there when the ship is moving forward. Where would, for example, a little piece of rock hit the ship and would be able to chip that paint. And you can spend the time to kind of refine these little shapes. This is really the last push, so take your time, have fun. It really is the most fun part, because it's almost done. There's no much pressure from trying to find the right design and all that. So now it's just taking the time and refining it. And you can keep refining it forever, upraising it and going even more into details. And it's really fun, so you ought to take your time right there. And you can layer these things and add stains and deeper cracks, and render these with the lighting and all that. That can be pretty fun. I'm really trying to think about these areas where the paint is all destroyed and disappeared. You really need to take the time, because if you use an overall texture, it will appear in random places, and it's not always it's usually not a good thing. You want to really think about where you put these marks. To make it as as intelligent as possible. And the advantage of using a mask is that you can always erase it, and you don't lose that detail ever, because you can erase it and repaint over it in white and make it appear again. So that's a good way. That's a good way of doing it, because you can always change the color, the whole color of everything, and you still retain that mask and that work that you did. So now I'm doing a second layer. I selected the areas with the chip paint, and I'm adding an extra layer of detailing there with a darker hue, a darker tone, and it just kind of pushes that a little bit deeper. So now I'm pretty much done with the overall image. I did a few adjustments again to the contrast and overall stuff, but now I'm adding a very quick little ship that's gonna be like patrolling around this one, or just accompanying it, and maybe they're part of the same fleet. Maybe they're the fighters that protect the bigger cruise ship. So I'm using the custom shapes again, creating a really quick silhouette, and then like I did earlier, I duplicate the ship layer. No, not yet, but I'll duplicate that ship, clipping mask on top of the silhouette, and this will give me free details that I don't need to paint, and they will stay in the same range as the main ship, which is what I want. Show that they're both on the same team. Just adding the light trail now. This is one of these really quick and dirty details that you can add at the end to kind of add some more story in there. It really isn't the storytelling piece. It's mostly to show off the ship, but it's always nice, and it's really quick, so why not? Just setting very quick lighting on it. This one is super small, so I don't need to spend too much time on the details. And that's pretty much it. Well, thank you guys for watching. I really hope you learned something from it, and it was a pleasure to make. So yeah, bye bye.